Hello everyone, and welcome to the Synology Partner Online Training. My name's Cody, and I'm going to be your guide this time around. We're all really excited to be bringing you this topic today, focusing on business continuity and disaster recovery, utilizing the Synology ecosystem. Now, this is one of the most important spot webinars that we host every year, so thank you for being here. What makes this one so special is that we're actually going to be focusing on DSM-7 and how this new operating system is going to be affecting your disaster recovery workflow in the future. So let's get started. So we all know there's several threats that we face that ultimately holds our business's data and IT core infrastructure at risk. First among these is going to be the accidents or human error that can occur whenever you're interacting or just around a system that you depend on daily. This could be spills or dropping or hitting equipment that ultimately causes damage to the system. Next, you have PC or server failure, which is really just hardware failure of critical infrastructure. For example, a server motherboard could go bad and you need to have backups in place so you can keep running while you mitigate that issue. Next, we have natural disasters. We all know that there's pretty much nowhere on planet Earth that is completely free of natural disasters. So you need to have some sort of backup plan in place so that you can mitigate those issues that might be happening in your region. Lastly, you have ransomware. Now, ransomware is something that's increasing at an ever-increasing rate in the IT ecosystem today. So you need to have automatic and multiple versions of your backups so that you can easily roll back your data to before that encryption event occurred. On top of this, we also have challenges associated with managing our IT data. We have scattered data that's pretty much all over the place. Of course, you have your PCs, which are just really the endpoints that your users work on daily. You then have those servers that we mentioned, which are truly the backbone of many businesses, and you need to have multiple versions for those so you can easily roll back to a previous point in time. The same goes for VMs on top of that. VMs may actually house critical server infrastructure themselves, so they're pretty much equal in many cases to the physical servers. Lastly, you then have your software as a service. You might have a bunch of data in different cloud platforms like Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace, for example, just to name a couple of the most prevalent ones. Now, to introduce you to Synology's Disaster Recovery Suite, you first want to take a look at Synology's Active Backup for Business. Now, this is going to be what you use to pull data from your endpoints to the Synology NAS device. And the effect of this is you're actually aggregating all of that scattered data finally into one location. You can then layer additional backup applications on top of that to begin building additional tiers to your disaster recovery plan. First among those is going to be snapshot replication. It's going to be what allows you to mirror Active Backup for Business or shared folder data and LUN data to a secondary site with the option of failover should anything happen to the primary site. Now let's say something happened to both your primary and your secondary site. Hyper Backup is going to be the next tier that you want to utilize because this allows you to push off NAS data to a cloud location like Synology's C2 storage. Now, if you're going to be creating your disaster recovery plan, you're going to be utilizing some combination of these three different applications, and we strongly urge you to use all three. So why might you want to utilize Active Backup for Business in your disaster recovery plan? First, you have access to some granular file level and folder level restore options with Synology's Active Backup for Business Recovery Portal. What this allows you to do is mount the bare metal and image-based backups you've taken with Active Backup for Business, and you can do file or folder level restores directly to those endpoint PCs or physical servers or even VMs. On top of that, you can also expose this Active Backup for Business portal to your actual endpoint users so they can actually do self-service recovery as needed. On top of that, let's say the whole Active Backup for Business portal is accessible, but your endpoint PCs are not, and you can't do a restore directly to them. You can even download that data directly through that recovery portal on your web browser. Now, these are bare metal image-based backups, so let's say a physical server goes down with a hardware issue. After you fix that hardware issue, you can use our recovery tool, which is just a bootable USB device, and you can actually re-image that PC, getting it back to a point in time before that hardware failure occurred. Now, the image-based backups for VMware and Hyper-V VMs are especially handy because they're actually agentless because we have full functionality and compatibility with both those virtualization platforms. So you don't have to go into each individual VM and add in the Active Backup for Business agent. You can just point it directly at that individual hypervisor like VMware, for example, and see all the VMs in that ESXi host and in that VMware cluster, for example. Also, with DSM-7 and Active Backup for Business 2.2, we also have support for compression and encryption at rest, which is answering a request from the entire Synology community. So thank you for all those feature requests. We're really happy to bring you that functionality. So let's go ahead and set up Active Backup for Business in your environment for the first time. So as you can see, we're inside of DSM-7, and we're going to take our Active Backup for Business agent, and we're going to pair this laptop that we're working on back to our Active Backup for Business instance. First, we're going to type in our credentials for the NAS. Now, keep in mind, we're going to be utilizing DDNS, but there's other access patterns that you can actually utilize. Local IP, if you wanted to do other external options, it's like your external IP address with port forwarding, or even a fully qualified domain name on top of that. So for us, again, we're just going to use DDNS, and we already have certificates already applied to this system. As you can see, a bunch of features are already enabled for this task, and that's because of our default template, which we'll get into adding in new templates in a second. You also have the option as an admin to change the device type here, and that's really just going to change what restore options are available to the system, but we're going to leave it on PC just to keep it in line with the template. You can change this later, and we'll get into that as well in a little bit. Now that we're all paired back to the system, you can see Active Backup for Business is now alerting us on the NAS that a system has been paired back to your Active Backup for Business instance, and as we open up this package here, under PC, you're going to see that my laptop is already listed under devices and that default task is already enabled. Now, if you wanted to add in new templates, you go down to Settings and just click on Template and Create. Under Template, you're going to see that you have a couple different settings available to you here. You're going to be able to name the template and also apply it to specific users and groups. Keep in mind, if you're connected to a domain, you can also do this by domain, users, and groups as well. As you can see, DSM-7 and Active Backup for Business 2.2 also has support for backing up Linux physical devices on top of that. But for us, we're just going to go over the Windows PC template creation in this case. So as you can see on this next page, we're not going to change too much. Entire device compression and encryption are all features we want to use for this specific backup. And we're going to send this to our ABB encrypted folder because it has compression and encryption enabled at rest. So as we hit next here, we're going to now be able to set up our backup schedule. You can do this manually, or more importantly, you can schedule this backup, which is best for DR practices. You can have this done daily, up to every hour if you want, and you can even have this backup by an event, that being your screen locked, signing out, or startup. So at the end of the day, whenever someone signs out, you can have this backup run to take care of all the hard work and all of the work that they did during their work day. Now, under this backup window, you can get very granular with how this backup will run. You can block off periods of time where this backup will not run and get very specific with your specific needs for this backup task. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK here. And the last checkbox here is an option that if this device is paired right back to the Synology NAS for the first time, that the backup automatically starts, just so you can get that baseline. Your retention policy is going to be pretty flexible with Active Backup. You can set a latest number of versions to keep all versions for a set number of days, or set advanced retention rules based on a grandparent, parent, child scenario, as you see with these custom fields here. So as we hit next, you'll be able to review all these other features that you have enabled for this template. And now anytime my Kodi H user adds a device for a Windows PC into this environment, it'll automatically have all those settings. Just like whenever we added this PC, the default template was already applied. So next, what we can do is if we go to this actual PC, you can do a couple different things here. You can actually manually still trigger this task as long as it's outside of that backup window that you might have set for this specific device. So if we click backup here, it's going to immediately start this backup, start initializing that baseline for my laptop that we just paired back to the system. For us today, we're actually going to go ahead and just cancel this specific backup and kind of go over creating a new backup task for a system just manually inside of Active Backup for Business. So as we click create here, we're going to be able to create a brand new task. We can go to enable here and create a new task. And this is going to be pretty much the same menu that you saw when we were creating the template. So pretty much the same workflow, choosing where you want the folder, what folder you want the device to actually live in. As you can see, we have compression and encryption enabled on this one. You can set up your backup task, have it be manual, scheduled. Again, just like the backup template that we created. And it's just that simple. And honestly, you can also set up a retention policy on top of that. Again, it's the same menu as before. You review all of your settings as you see here, and you're done with setting up the task. So now that we set up these physical devices, let's go ahead and set up a virtual machine task here. What we're going to do here is actually go into our hypervisor menu, and you can see we already have an ESXi node paired back, but you can easily add a new hypervisor by typing in its address and your administrator credentials. For us in free ESXi, we just used our root credentials. Once you have it paired back to your VMware or Hyper-V system, you'll be able to see all of the list of VMs inside of that system automatically, and you don't have to actually add in a specific agent. You can just go in and create a task, as you see here, without any extra work. Once it's paired back to that hypervisor, you can go into this task and select any which of the VMs you want from your backup list. For us here, we're going to go ahead and back up this Windows 10 device here. We already have VMware tools enabled on this system. Keep that in mind. We're also going to send this backup image to our ABB encrypted folder for that compression and encryption that is new on DSM-7 and Active Backup 2.2. And on this next page, you can enable several different advanced features, but as you enable those, make sure that you actually check these information boxes. You can see that for application-aware backups, you need VSS enabled on the VM, as well as VMware tools installed on that. On our next screen here, we're going to be able to actually set up the retention policies for this specific system in this environment. But what's new in Active Backup for Business, you'll see that it actually does some checks for all those advanced features you enabled, like change block tracking. It'll check to make sure you have all the correct settings on the VM already good to go. So on this next page, again, this is going to be where you set up your schedule for these VM backups. It's just like Active Backup for Business for physical devices. You can have it back up every hour. You can block out periods of time based on this backup window, and has a very similar retention policy menu. Again, this is going to be allowing you to set a maximum number of versions, keep all versions for a period of days, or set up a grandparent, parent, child backup policy based on your organization's needs. On this next page, again, you can choose which users have access to this image of this VM. You can do this again by local users groups, and again, if you're joined to a domain, it also applies to that. Once more, you'll check all of your backup settings and make sure those are good to go, and click Done. Now your backup will run at the next scheduled time based on how you actually set up that task. Now that we've set up Active Backup for Business and we've begun aggregating all of that scattered data finally into one location, we can now begin to look at adding in additional applications to create more tiers in your disaster recovery plan. The first application that you want to use on top of Active Backup for Business is Snapshot Replication. What makes this application so special is that it utilizes BTRFS-based snapshots, which are an inherent feature inside of the file system that's typically on a Synology NAS. These snapshots occur up to every 5 minutes, and there's almost no performance impact on the system when those snapshots are being taken. You can do local snapshots to provide an ability to roll back shared folder or LUN data locally. So if something happened to your Active Backup for Business data inside of that folder, you can easily roll back that folder to a previous point in time. Now, remote snapshots are a little bit different. This is going to be the solution that allows you to fail over to a secondary site after your initial replication. So if something happened to the primary site, let's say a natural disaster or some other accident, you can easily fail over to that secondary site, bring that data live, reconstitute your Active Backup for Business data, and restore to other resources that might be available at that disaster recovery site. So with that said, let's go ahead and set up snapshots for the first time and get this replication task going. So here we are in DSM-7, and what we're going to do is just dive right into snapshot replication to set up both those local and replicated snapshots. On this main overview screen, it should be pretty blank for you unless you've already set up snapshots, and this will be a good place to go just to kind of check the health of your overall snapshot system as a whole. So if we take a look at the snapshots module here, you can see that we already have some Active Backup for Business encrypted snapshots already enabled in our environment. If you go to settings to enable this local snapshot schedule, you just have to enable this checkbox right here, and then you can go deeper into some of the settings like changing what days that snapshot can actually run on. You can also set frequency any which way you want. You can see you have quite a few different options, and under more options, you can get as frequent as every 5 minutes if that's the recovery point that you guys need. Now, under retention, you can specify the max number of snapshots to keep up to 1024. You can specify how many snapshots to keep based on how many days you want to keep them, or you can set up a grandparent, parent, child policy similar to Active Backup for Business right here under the advanced rules. Now, under the advanced settings, which is the other tab to the right here, you're going to see that you have a couple different options. One of those is making snapshots visible, which allows you to browse through snapshots and actually restore them at a granular level. So you could actually restore individual files and folders through snapshots if you wanted to. Now that we've set up those local snapshots, you can also do a couple other things like manually take a snapshot. Whenever you do that, you can actually lock the snapshot so it won't be rotated or deleted, and you can go ahead and write a description. As we trigger the snapshot, what you'll notice is that it's almost instantaneous that the snapshot's taken, and that's, again, an inherent feature of the BTRFS file system that is inside of the Synology NAS. On top of that, you can also check out a snapshot list if you wanted to browse through all the snapshots that are in the system. But as we move through the replication menu here, we're going to choose our remote replication source because we want to actually push this off device. Local replicated snapshots are really just sending it to another volume, like another storage shelf on your Synology NAS, for example. So we want to go to remote, and we're going to hit this drop-down menu here because we have some other Synology NAS devices on the local network. So it's going to do a quick scan to find all of those other devices on this local network. We're going to go to a destination called Athena, but keep in mind snapshot replication also works for external IP addresses, fully qualified domain names, DDNS, as long as you have the proper port forwarding set up. So we're going to go to Athena and type in the proper credentials for that device and use an encrypted connection. Because remember, we're sending some active backup for business data over, so it is critical for our disaster recovery plan that this data is secure. On this next screen, right now, why it's loading is it's authenticating with that second device, and then you can choose where you want these actual replicated snapshots to live at the destination. For us, we're just going to do volume 1 because it's got a little bit more space available to it. And we're going to choose what folders you actually want to replicate. You don't have to just replicate one folder at a time. You could replicate multiple. But for us, we're just going to grab this Active Backup for Business encrypted folder. On this next screen, you can set up the initial copy over the network. Now, we're on a local network with this destination, so it's going to be pretty quick. That's how we're going to replicate our initial snapshot. But you can also do this with an external USB hard drive, for example, if you wanted to seed this environment. This is especially handy if you were concerned over bandwidth usage, for example. Lastly is the replication schedule. Again, this is separate from the local snapshot schedule you've created. It's pretty much the same menu. You can go as frequent as every 5 minutes for your Active Backup for Business data. And you can configure a snapshot window, blocking out periods of time where you don't want this replication to occur if you needed to. And it's just as granular as you saw with all the other transfer windows that you saw previously. Now, lastly, you have your retention policy, same exact window as the local snapshots. You can specify the max number of snapshots to keep them all for a period of time in days, or you can set up an advanced retention policy based on a grandparent, parent, child policy that meets your organization's needs. Once that's all finished and you hit next here, you're going to see that you have a very similar page once again to the local snapshots, but in this menu you have the option to replicate your local snapshots along with your replicated snapshots you just created. But keep in mind, enabling this option may increase the time needed for replication because you're sending more snapshots and more data across. Once we're done here, your replication task is now complete, and it will begin replicating this data across based on your schedule. What it does first is it's going to create this relationship and create that read-only folder at the destination. So that's why it's loading right now. It's creating this whole relationship, that replicated folder on the secondary device, and it's going to begin this replication task here. So now that we've set up multiple tiers in our disaster recovery plan, we have Active Backup for Business taking care of your local backups and recoverability, and we have Snapshot Replication providing offsite redundancy and failover functionality. Hyper Backup is going to be that final tier in your disaster recovery strategy. Hyper Backup is pretty much our most traditional backup solution, and it has some advanced features like data compression and client-side encryption. This encryption is AES 256-bit and RSA 2048-bit encryption before it ever leaves the Synology NAS. Now, I know what you're going to ask. What about in transit? Your data is also encrypted in transit, and that's a mandatory setting inside of all Hyper Backup tasks. Your destinations for these tasks can include a local or remote NAS or even file server, but the real reason why you'll want to use Hyper Backup is the ability to back up your data to a cloud location like Synology C2 Storage. This also provides the most deep versioning that we have in any one of our backup solutions, with 65,000 versions at your disposal in Hyper Backup, allowing you to stay compliant in pretty much any vertical and allowing you to keep over 10 years of data depending on your Hyper Backup's task settings. Now, let's go ahead and set up Hyper Backup for the first time, sending your Active Backup for Business data up to Synology C2 Storage. So to set up our final tier of backups, we're in DSM-7 once again, and we're going to go ahead and open up our Hyper Backup module here. As you can see, we already have some Synology C2 backups already sending up some data from our Active Backup for Business encrypted folder, so that's already been successful. But let's walk through setting up a task for you. As you can see, there's all those different cloud repositories that we spoke of, but we're going to be focusing specifically on Synology C2 Storage. Once you hit next, after choosing your destination for Synology C2 storage, you'll be prompted to log in to your Synology account that has this C2 subscription. For me, I'm sending this data to our US data centers, and we're going to allow access to C2 storage for our Hyperbackup instance. What you can see here is we're just going to leave the title of that repository the same as default, and we're now going to select what data we want to back up. Now, knee-jerk reaction might be to back up these entire folders, but what you can see, there's a couple subfolders here. If we take a look at this information bubble for the grayed out folder, it actually says that this doesn't actually contain very much data at all. It contains none of your data, and so it's not supported for backup. And really, this add active backup folder is the only folder that you need to send up. It's what contains your true deduplicated data for the system. This next page is for application backups, but we're not going to need that this time around. And next, we can actually enable some advanced features inside of Synology's Hyperbackup. You can see you can enable change detail log if you needed more details on what's changed since the last backup interval. But a big one for people was also bandwidth limitation. You can throttle this connection if you wanted to, but keep in mind that after the initial backup, this is block level incremental backup, so it shouldn't chew through too much bandwidth after that first backup. Next, another big one for everyone here is going to be the client-side encryption here at the bottom. Now again, this is AES 256-bit encryption and RSA 2048-bit encryption. So once we enable this and type in our password, it's going to be fully locked down before the data ever leaves the Synology NAS. And keep in mind, transfer encryption is enabled by default. It's grayed out. It's mandatory. You cannot disable that for sending your secure data off the NAS. It'll be encrypted in transit. Of course, take heed of this warning. If you forget your password or the encryption key is lost, you will not be able to unlock the data, even if it's inside Synology C2. Lastly, you have your rotation settings. Now, you can set up a couple different things. We have some things like Smart Recycle, which has a policy that's described inside of the information bubble. But the big thing that you should know about Hyperbackup is how deep the versioning goes. It's actually our solution that has the deepest versioning out of all of our backups, like including Active Backup for Business and Snapshot Replication, with support for 65,000 versions in Hyperbackup, allowing you to stay compliant in lots of different verticals and even retain your data for over 10 years, depending on your backup settings. Once that's all done, you can go ahead and hit yes to backup now. But do keep in mind that at the very bottom, you can see that our PEM key has been downloaded to our system. So what you want to do in this scenario is actually go and show the folder that this specific PEM key is living in, and you want to actually make sure you remove this PEM key off of your local device so that your encryption key isn't just sitting on your computer willy-nilly. It downloads because you want to then take that specific PEM key, put it on an encrypted USB, and kind of lock it down. Make sure only people you trust have access to it. It's really just an extra copy of your key so that you don't automatically forget your password or anything like that. But do make sure that you actually remove that key from your local PC. So again, that encryption key isn't just sitting there. So let's take a look at this tiered disaster recovery strategy we've created utilizing the Synology ecosystem. On our first tier, you have your local backups and automatic versioning. And the first package you're going to want to use here is Synology's Active Backup for Business. Now, this is what pulls data off of your endpoints and onto the Synology NAS to finally get all that data in one location. On the same tier, you're going to also be able to use the local snapshots inside of Snapshot Replication to provide additional versioning and rollback support for your shared folder data, Active Backup for Business data, and your local Synology LUNs that might be on the system, so you can easily restore locally should you need to. Now for Tier 2, this is going to be your offsite redundancy, and in this case, you're going to use primarily Snapshot Replication. And specifically in this module, you're going to be using the Replicated Snapshots option. What this does is it'll send your shared folder, ABB data, or even your Synology LUN data over to a secondary site every so often. It can be up to every 5 minutes. If there was ever an issue at your primary site, you could fail over that data, bring all that data live, reconstitute your Active Backup for Business data, and spin up VMs, for example, at that secondary location if you have virtualization resources available to it. Now, on your final tier here is going to be about cloud backups, and you're going to be utilizing Synology's Hyperbackup to push that data off the NAS to a cloud destination. It's our most traditional backup solution, provides our deepest versioning with 65,000 versions, and also supports client-side encryption. Your best bet when utilizing Hyperbackup is actually to utilize Synology's C2 storage. The reason being is quite simply C2 integrates most fully with Hyperbackup when compared to other cloud backup solutions that Hyperbackup is actually compatible with. So what that means is you can explore and restore from your C2 backups either directly on the NAS Backup Explorer. There's also backup explorers for your desktop PCs and Mac OS devices. And lastly, you can also explore and restore data directly from Synology C2 through your web browser. You can easily go and grab and download data from C2 even if you don't have access to your Synology NAS device. So let's now discuss what you should do when disaster strikes now that we've set up this entire Synology ecosystem. First, you want to formulate a plan based on the situation at hand. And the reason being is you don't want to just start restoring things willy-nilly without really getting your arms around the problem first. One prime example of this is, let's say you're a victim, unfortunately, of a ransomware attack. You want to make sure you fully mitigate that ransomware attack, get all of that malware off of your systems and off of your network before you go restoring actual endpoint PCs. The reason being is if you go through the whole process of the restore and you haven't fully cleared the ransomware from your network, you could be right back at square one with that ransomware repropagating out to that endpoint PC and encrypting it once more. So you want to make sure you fully understand the problem before you go restoring things. And of course, after that, you want to go ahead and then execute the proper restores utilizing the Synology ecosystem we just set up and we just overviewed just a couple seconds ago. So by formulating a battle plan, what we really mean is you need to understand what failure occurred on your systems. Was it a software failure? Was it a hardware issue? Is this a regional natural disaster that you're trying to mitigate? Or are you the victim of an attack from some nefarious third party? You also want to understand if there's any other resources available either on your local systems network or at your DR location. For example, Active Backup for Business needs to have somewhere to restore to. Let's say you failed over to a secondary site and you have some extra virtualization resources available to it at that DR location. You can reconstitute your Active Backup for Business data and use that extra virtualization compute power that you might have at that secondary location and actually spin up VMs of your virtual machine backups. And you could even do that with your physical images of your physical PCs and servers and actually bring them physical to virtual, all just using Active Backup for Business. Now, you also need to understand how quickly and to what point do you need to restore. Choosing what point you need to restore to is really just choosing the correct version to meet your needs during this restore. How quickly is going to be choosing what restore pathway you want to take utilizing Active Backup for Business. You essentially have two options. You can either do a full virtual machine restore in VMware or do a bare metal restore, for example. Or you can do an instant restore into VMware, which usually takes about 30 seconds because you're mounting that backup image directly. So you can choose either one of those pathways to meet your recovery point and recovery time objectives for this disaster recovery scenario. So let's talk about local failure of endpoints or file deletion. You want to use Active Backup for Business to restore either physical to virtual, or you can utilize Active Backup for Business self-recovery portal to actually pull files or folders out. You can also utilize local snapshots to actually roll back your data of your Active Backup for Business folder, for example. If anything happened to it, let's say someone accidentally deleted some data out of there. You can use those snapshots to actually roll back that Active Backup for Business data to a previous point, so you'll always have an extra copy of those versions. So let's go ahead and provide an example. In this scenario, you have your Synology NAS device already in place, and you have some physical PCs and physical servers in your environment. You may even have some file server data already existing on the Synology NAS, and you map some drives out from there to your endpoint users in your environment. Here, you'll have your Tier 1 already taken care of. You'll have the Active Backup for Business application pulling data from your endpoint PCs and providing versioning for your endpoint PC backups. On top of that, you may also use snapshot replication to provide local snapshots of that file server data that might be living on the Synology NAS. Now, in this scenario, let's say that there was an issue either at the hardware or the software level. Here, if there was an issue at the hardware level for your physical PCs or physical servers, you could use Active Backup for Business to actually restore the PC bare metal. You could use the Active Backup for Business recovery portal to pull data out of your backups if you needed it immediately. Or you could even take your images for your physical devices and spin them up on the NAS itself in Virtual Machine Manager, or even spin them up in another virtualization platform like VMware or Hyper-V. On top of that, you can actually utilize snapshot replication to roll back any accidental file deletions for your shared folder data that you might be using as a file server. So in this case, both of these issues, hardware issues, software issues, can both be mitigated by Active Backup for Business and snapshot replication. So now let's demo Instant Restore into VMware, which is going to be your fastest restore time for your Active Backup for Business data. So now let's go ahead and step back into Active Backup for Business and actually do a recovery scenario for our environment. So again, this is going to be simulating a local recovery of an issue with a VM, for example. So in ESXi, remember we took an image of this Win 10 PC here. So we're going to commit a crime here and actually power off this operating system. We're going to just yank the power out of it, and we're going to then delete it from our ESXi environment here. And remember, we've already taken a backup image of this Win 10 device here. So as we hop back over to the Synology NAS in this case, you're going to see that when we open up Active Backup for Business and actually check out the status of this VM inside of the Virtual Machine tab here, you're going to notice once we have this refresh with our ESXi environment that there's going to be a little alert next to the name of that specific VM. What you'll notice is it now says VM not found in the hypervisor. That's because Active Backup for Business can tell it's no longer listed in the inventory for ESXi. So now you can go here and actually restore this VM utilizing a previous version. So we're going to go restore directly to VMware, and we want the quickest recovery time possible. So we're going to do an instant restore, which mounts this backup image directly as a data store inside of VMware, so you can really just boot the VM in just a few seconds. So we're going to power this VM automatically after restoration and hop back right over to ESXi. As we look down at the bottom of recent tasks in ESXi, which is a running tally of what's going on with the system, you can see there's some activity. Pretty much immediately whenever you click the restore button, the NAS and ESXi communicate seamlessly. What you're going to notice is we're going to get a question from VMware here in just a moment. And now we're going to go ahead and say we moved it and answer this question. As we open up this specific image here and open up the web console, you're going to see we're going to get the all too familiar Windows loading screen with the circular dots going on. This is just the boot process of Windows, and you're going to see that we're going to have access to our main desktop in just a moment once this boot process finishes. And since this is a direct backup image, what you're going to see is it's going to have pretty much exactly all the settings that I had on the system from last time I logged in from when this backup image was taken. So you're going to see my user pop up right at the very beginning because I was the last user on the system. And as we log in here, you're going to see as we slide up, you can see that my user Cody is already listed because we did a full backup image restore. And as you can see, it's logging in just like normal, even though we did an instant restore into VMware. Now that we see the desktop, you know that your full boot was correct and your whole restore operation went off seamlessly, as we mentioned. So let's go ahead and hop back over to our main NAS device, and you can see this restore occurred in all of about 29 seconds, giving you the fastest recovery time possible out of all Synology backup solutions. So now let's look at another example, and this is going to simulate a failure at the primary site. In this scenario, you're going to utilize snapshot replication to help you fail over data should anything happen at that primary site. You're going to use snapshot replication to bring data for Active Backup for Business live at that secondary location. You can then take that data and relink it into a brand new secondary instance of Active Backup for Business, and then take that data, spin it up as a VM inside of a hypervisor that's linked to Active Backup for Business, and begin working on those VMs. At that point, you would provide your primary site employees with VPN access to the secondary site so that they could begin accessing any data that they need that was reconstituted after that snapshot failover. Now, while you're working on that data, you're going to be creating new data as you're working through that disaster recovery scenario. Whenever you're ready to get everything back to normal, snapshot replication actually provides failback procedures for that snapshotted data. So what that means is that you can take data that you've created while in this disaster recovery scenario at that secondary site. You can bring it back over to your primary site and make sure the original topology is the same with the primary replicating to the secondary. So you don't lose any data whenever you go to actually fail back after you've mitigated all of the issues. Let's go ahead and take a look at a diagram for this one. In this scenario, you have all of that data for your backups for Active Backup for Business and your file server data already taken care of and on the Synology NAS. In this case, you have a secondary site that you actually use snapshot replication and replicated snapshots to send that other data over. What that means is all of that Active Backup for Business data and file server data that you might be snapshotting over is now in a read-only state at that secondary site. It's lying in wait until you have a failover scenario. So in this case, let's talk if there was a fire, if there was a hardware or software issue, or even a ransomware attack at your primary site. You could then use snapshot replication to actually fail over your data. And what that does is it brings up the data at that secondary location, makes it writable and usable, and you can then reconstitute active backup for business data, spin things up, and use any other data that you've replicated across to that secondary system. In doing so, you're actually mitigating pretty much all the main threats that could be happening to your system as long as your secondary site isn't also compromised. So let's go ahead and demo snapshot failover and how to restore that failed over snapshot data into active backup for business in a secondary location. So here we are back inside of DSM-7 on our main Synology NAS. Now, keep in mind we're going to be simulating a failure at our primary NAS to our secondary DR location. So what we're going to do is hop over to our destination, and you can see we're on a server named Athena now. And remember, that was our destination whenever we set up our replication task. So if we go to snapshot replication at the destination and go down to recovery, you're going to be able to perform a failover as you need. Keep in mind, in our environment, we actually don't have any missed snapshot instances for this replication task. So whenever we go to action right here, you're going to see that we don't have an option to do a regular failover. So in our scenario, just to simulate this, we're going to force the failover. So keep in mind, if your system missed a replication instance, that failover button, that regular one, would be available to you. Just in a couple moments, you'll see that this failover will have been completed and will have been failed over to the server. That's why that specific folder now has a warning. Now what we need to do is we need to bring this data into Active Backup for Business as a storage module so that we can then access those backups. The way that you're going to do this is you're going to open up Active Backup for Business and go down to storage. You're going to see some other storage modules already paired back to the system, but we're missing the Active Backup for Business encrypted -1 folder. So we're going to relink this and actually select the folder that we want. And you can see that it has our Spot and Spot VM tasks that we created just a bit ago. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK here. And now that is all relinked into our system. It just takes a few moments here. And we have protected devices now listed, and we still have our data reduction ratio as well. If we go into virtual machine, we're now going to see those tasks that we created. Again, those Spot and Spot VM tasks that we utilized in the previous setup demos. And just like before, now we can actually use this restore button to restore from a previous version. Now keep in mind this is an encrypted folder, so now you need to type in your encryption key. We remember our password, so we're just going to go ahead and type in the password, but you could also input the PEM key if you had that saved. Now we're going to restore back into VMware, do an instant restore once more into the same location, and just like before, we can power on VM automatically after the restoration. Once this is all finished and we hit OK to enable all the NFS services that we need, we're going to have this restored in about 30 seconds, just like we did before. Let's talk about a multi-site failure. In this scenario, you'll have no access to Site 1 or Site 2. So this is pretty common in some regional disasters, maybe a natural disaster hit both sites in this example. If you are utilizing Synology C2 storage as your backup destination, you can utilize the C2 web login to do a file level restore, even if you don't have access to your original Synology NAS devices. Now, if you have another new Synology NAS device, you can use Hyper Backup to restore directly to that NAS from the cloud, taking care of all the data that you had backed up, the Synology NAS configs, and even any application configs you included in that Hyper Backup task. After that restore is finished, you can again reconstitute that data for Active Backup for Business, for example, very similar to what you could do whenever you did the failovers for snapshot replication. Once that data is down from the cloud, you can reconstitute it and spin it up on the NAS itself or on some other virtualization platform like VMware or Hyper-V. So in this example scenario, as you can see, we have the previous two systems we've already set up. That being Site 1 with the Active Backup for Business data and some file server data that's taken care of with snapshot versioning. You then have your secondary site that has all of that data replicated across it, utilizing replicated snapshots. Now at Tier 3 from your primary location, you're going to back up your data through Hyper Backup to Synology's C2 storage. So that will take care of all that data that's been replicated across the secondary site and all that data that you backed up with Active Backup for Business and local snapshots. Now, with a regional multi-site disaster, typically we see natural disasters and ransomware attacks being the most prevalent in the ones that can actually take down two sites at once. It's either going to be a regional disaster or a coordinated attack that does so. In this case, neither Site 1 nor Site 2 are accessible. So all you have at your disposal is the data that you have in Synology C2 storage. But fear not, all you need is another Synology NAS if you wanted to do a full restore, or you could do file level restore utilizing the Synology C2 web portal. In this scenario, if you did have a secondary NAS, however, you could pull all of that data down from Synology C2 through Hyper Backup and reconstitute all that data on a new Synology NAS. From there, it's just like what we've done previously, relinking that Active Backup for Business data, spinning up that data as a VM inside of the Synology NAS itself on Virtual Machine Manager, or utilizing a secondary virtualization platform like VMware Hyper-V to spin that data up. In this case, both your natural disasters and the ransomware attacks would be mitigated because you're restoring from the cloud to a completely new Synology NAS device. So let's go ahead and check out a restore from Synology C2 and how we can reconstitute that data in a new Active Backup for Business instance. So as you can see, we're in a different Synology NAS than we've been interacting with so far. Keep in mind, Athena was our disaster recovery location, and our primary was HQ DS3617XS2. So now we're in a completely new NAS device, and this one is named Minerva DSM, and it's actually just so happens to be a virtual DSM instance in our case. So as we open up Hyper Backup, what you'll notice is you're automatically prompted to create a backup, but in this scenario, we actually want to do a full restore back onto the Synology NAS. So we're going to go ahead and select the restore option here, and we're going to choose from existing repositories. We're basically pointing Hyper Backup back at whatever bucket we sent that data up to, in our case, Synology C2 storage. As we hit next here, of course, we're going to need to authenticate back to Synology C2 storage, log in with the correct account that was the original destination for your previous Hyper Backup task. And once we authenticate and grant access to Hyper Backup, just like we did before, we'll be able to grab that data and restore it to this new Synology NAS. You can select what directory you actually want to pull from. And since we have multiple in this account, we're going to choose the correct one, which was our HQ DS3617XS2. So it's going to be right down here in the middle. Once that's selected, we can now move on and actually type in our encryption key, because remember, we set up encryption on this task. So just like before, we remember the encryption password, so we're going to type that in. Keep in mind, you could also use your PEM key and use the encryption key option to actually upload that PEM key if you need it. So now it's unencrypting that data, and now it's going to be searching for available configuration files inside of that backup, because each time you do a Hyper Backup task for your Synology NAS device, it also sends up the NAS config data in a mandatory fashion. So it's going to have things like the user settings, domain and LDAP settings already backed up to Synology C2. So if you did need to restore that, you could definitely do that here. But for our scenario, it's actually not needed. So we're going to let this finish searching for those configuration files inside of this specific directory. And then we're just going to say, do not restore system configuration, and move on. So now that that configuration file has been all searched through and it's grabbed all the settings from Synology C2, we're actually not going to restore any of these, but as you can see, you could easily just, at a click of a button, pick and choose which one of these modules you need to restore if you didn't need to use all of those configurations. For us, we're moving on and just going to choose the data that we want to restore from Synology C2. So right now it's parsing through that directory folder, finding all of the versions and creating that shared folder hierarchy that you had whenever you backed up that data. So we're just going to restore this whole Active Backup for Business encrypted folder, which is housing that Add Active Backup folder that we selected previously. So we're just going to go ahead and select that and move on. And go ahead and hit done here. And this is going to trigger your whole restore operation in this window. It's going to be able to run on the back end of the Synology NAS. You don't actually have to leave this restore window open. So we're going to go ahead and let this run for a little while this restore finishes and be back in just a moment. So now you can see we've allowed this restore to occur, and let's go ahead and check the logs to make sure that worked out okay from that restore task. So as we open up the logs here, you're going to see that we did have a successful restore from Synology C2. So that's all good to go. We brought that Active Backup for Business folder down. So just like with snapshot replication, we need to relink this folder as a storage node inside of Active Backup for Business. But keep in mind, this is a brand new Active Backup instance, so you need to activate it on this new Synology NAS. So we're going to go ahead and go through this operation. This is just signing up with your specific Synology account. Again, Active Backup for Business does not cost you anything. It is completely license free. So once this application is all activated, we can go ahead and hit OK. And now we can relink this data under storage back into this system, similar to what we did with snapshot replication. But as we go through virtual machine, you'll see there's nothing in there. There's nothing in the tasks, nothing in the virtual machine list. So when we relink this, you're going to see that it's going to have all of this data that we created originally. So let's go ahead and click relink here. And after this is done relinking, you're going to have access to those other VM images that we actually sent up to Synology C2. Of course, I didn't actually save any of my credentials into that task, so let's re-authenticate with our hypervisor here. I'm going to go ahead and just type in my root credentials for our ESXi environment. And as you can see, we're green and good to go. And right whenever I hit close, I'll be able to see all of those VMs inside of the system in just a few moments. Now, as we go to task list, you can see that we have this spot task now, and we can go ahead and click restore for our Win 10 device. And just like before, again, this is encrypted from Synology C2, and it's also encrypted inside of the active backup task. So I also need to put in my encryption key here. And we can do an instant restore once more to the original location. Again, very similar operation to doing a snapshot failover, relink, and restore into VMware. So once again, since we're doing instant restore, you're going to see we'll have access to this VM in around 30 seconds in our case. So we went over quite a bit today, going over how to actually create a tiered disaster recovery plan utilizing the Synology ecosystem. We then moved into some example scenarios that we went over to actually use and execute these recovery operations utilizing that same system. With that said, we're going to go over everything we learned today. And on that topic of recovery options, Active Backup for Business has quite a few recovery options available to it. As you look at this table, you'll see that Windows Server VMware Hyper-V VMs pretty much has every recovery option available to it throughout the entire recovery options for Active Backup for Business. You'll notice things like Windows Server doesn't have things like instant restore to VM host, cross-platform recovery, or instant restore to Synology VMM. One thing I wanted to note here is that is just because it is categorized as Windows 10 PCs. That does not mean that you cannot spin up a Windows 10 PC as a VM inside of Virtual Machine Manager or another hypervisor like VMware or Hyper-V. All this is, as a Windows 10 category, is an organizational flag inside of your Active Backup for Business system. You can actually promote Windows 10 PC devices into a physical server category, and then once it's actually promoted to that category, you will have the same restore options available to the physical Windows servers that you see on this table. So Active Backup for Business has a full range of flexible recovery options to meet your recovery needs in the event of a disaster. Now, we went over 3 different main packages for our entire disaster recovery plan, that being Active Backup for Business, Snapshot Replication, and Hyper Backup. Again, Active Backup for Business pulls data onto your Synology NAS, and it can back up to every hour. You can even have backups that trigger based on if a user logs in, logs out, if the computer starts up, for example. You also have snapshot replication with both local snapshots, which can take care of your file server data. It can take care of the Active Backup for Business folder, even can back up your LUNs and replicate those offsite. On top of that, those snapshots, like I just mentioned, can be replicated offsite, and this allows you to have some failover functionality for some second site redundancy. All of this is rounded out by the ultimate offsite backup solution, that being Hyper Backup. This is what allows you to integrate with Synology C2 storage and other cloud providers to back up your data off to another cloud provider, so that if you lost access to both your primary and secondary NAS, you could easily actually pull that data down from the cloud as you need and reconstitute it on a brand new Synology NAS and get up and running once you have everything set up. So let's talk a little bit about when you might need a Synology partner. So if you're unfamiliar with disaster recovery best practices, it's a really good idea to begin consulting with a Synology partner or MSP so that they can help plan out this disaster recovery strategy with you so that you don't actually have to. On top of that, if you do not have a dedicated IT staff, then it's a good idea to partner with a Synology partner or MSP because they can actually provide service level agreements to make sure that you're taken care of within just a couple hours so that they can help mitigate these issues as soon as they arise. So that about wraps things up here today. I just wanted to say thank you to the Synology community for being so active with us and actually putting in those feature requests. As mentioned, one of those features there today, the compression and encryption for Synology's Active Backup for Business, was a direct feature request from the Synology community. So we hope to keep this community active and keep it influencing the products because really it's the Synology users out there that are driving the feature sets that you so enjoy. Also, thank you for attending this one because it's one of the most important Synology Partner online trainings you can attend as a small business owner, because having a disaster recovery plan in place will ensure that you'll be able to affect your vertical from today into the future. So thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.